Fast and furiously. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jen Buchanan, and I warmly welcome all of you to this morning's Future Anything live learning session. I can see in the background there's some familiar faces joining us on this early Thursday morning. Promises to be a conversation leaving you inspired for the day. So thank you for joining us. At Future Anything, our live learning sessions are designed to be able to chat with amazing thinkers and doers, movers and shakers on topics designed to help build enterprising. All right, just waiting for a couple of audio there. I might just skip to housekeeping. If you have an opportunity now just to be able to click on your mic and just mute that, that'd be amazing. Just allows for great audio. So I'll just take a moment. Wonderful. This session is being recorded. It'll be available for viewing on the Future Anything website. And please, throughout today and this morning's chat, if any kind of questions, thoughts or comments pop up for you and you'd like to share those, please do share those in the chat function. I'm joining you today from Naarm, from Melbourne, and hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And across Australia today, we meet on many different lands. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging across the many beautiful lands on which we're joining this morning. And if you have an opportunity now just to pop in the chat, I'd love to hear which lands you are joining us from this morning for this wonderful webinar. I'd also like to pay my respects to any First Nations people joining us on the call today. So please take a moment, jot that down in the chat. Okay, but joining us from a long way away, over there in San Francisco, I couldn't be more thrilled than to be able to introduce today's guest, Chris Shipley. And she has just released this wonderful book, The Empathy Advantage, co-authored with Heather McGowan. Now, if you've heard me speak or seen any of my posts, then you'll know that I'm a huge fan of their first book. I also happen to have it on my table here, The Adaptation Advantage. And this came out in 2020, right in the heart of COVID. And I remember lining outside of Reading's bookshop here in Melbourne, waiting for my turn to enter the bookshop to be able to go and purchase this book. So these two books now have pride of place on my bookshelf, and they are certainly my go-to books when trying to understand anything around future trends, especially in the context of education. So let me introduce our guest this morning, Chris Shipley. Chris is a strategic thinker, a writer, an entrepreneur, and she has this amazing ability to take really complex issues that we all tend to be grappling with when we look at the modern workplace. And she's just able to make this information easily accessible and understandable. And possibly why I've become such a huge fan of the work. It just makes sense. And I love this quote by Chris. It's in the current book, The Empathy Advantage. It's hard to find the right answers when you're not asking the right question. So my hope today is that some of the questions we'll explore will help us understand not only where we are today, but how we can build the capacity and skills of it, not only ourselves, but the people around us, to have a better understanding of where we are headed tomorrow. So Chris, a very warm welcome to our webinar this morning, although 2:30 p.m. where you are in San Francisco. Truly appreciative of your time. We've had a huge interest in this webinar with educators across Australia and internationally joining us. Truly looking forward to the next 40 minutes with you in this conversation. So welcome, Chris.
Oh, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I will say that when Jen and I get together on a Skype call, the conversations can go in many different directions. So I'm looking forward to the questions. And I'm actually just really excited already to know that I can now say, people stood in lines outside bookstores to get my book. The details can be, we can skip over that, but I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that endorsement.
Thank you, Chris. Chris, this one actually, I've been waiting for a while for this one to arrive. Finally arrived in the post last week, and I did a second read of this. And it really struck me again, just the importance of the conversation. So let's start here. Why at this point in time, what is it that you're noting that is calling for this more empathetic approach to leadership, and possibly, especially in our schools? What are the shifts that you're noticing?
Yeah, well, let me just back up a little bit, since you talked about the first book, and just say that when Heather and I completed that book in December of 2019, we were preparing for a launch in April of 2020 that would include all sorts of road trips and speaking events and all the things you would normally do when you roll out a book. And of course, in March of 2020, the world, as we know it, stopped. And we went into this lockdown mode, which meant we had to adapt and really rethink what it meant to roll out a book. But the book itself is all about how do you adapt in very rapidly changing environment. And as a result, it kind of became an accidental guide to leadership through the pandemic. But then we kind of watched what happened for 3 years or 2.5 years. And last May, so just really less than a year ago, we said, the workforce has really shifted. And a lot of those trends were starting well before the pandemic. But the pandemic certainly put a bright lens on what was happening. And essentially, people went home from their offices in March 2020, went home from your classrooms. You had to think about a whole different way to, what does it mean to be an educator when you're using distance learning tools like Zoom to do that job? And what I think it did for many of us was kind of instill a sense of trust and autonomy and agency, right? We now had a lot more control over our workday. We didn't have bosses or superintendents or colleagues kind of looking over our shoulders or being shoulder to shoulder with us. So we had to think and act much more independently. And we were largely trusted to do that. So, this was last May. I said, I think this workforce is never going to be the same. And what is it going to mean to lead people? What is it going to mean to teach? What's it going to mean to be engaged in a society that is really forever changed by this pandemic? And so we went to our publisher and said, we think that there's a follow-on to the first book. And they said, yeah, we do too. Can you get it done in about 3 months? So last summer was the last summer. We finished the book in a record 100 days. And it's just been out here now for about a month. But the premise is exactly that even though we were on a trend line that saw many of these things, as inevitable consequences of just changing time and rapidly evolving technology and social change, the workforce and the way we were trained to participate in it, the way we were trained to lead in it, that took us up to this pandemic time is not the same that's going to take us out of it. And so let's really think about what that means. And what I think it means, and particularly in the emerging age of artificial intelligence and generative AI, is we have to just be much more human. And being human, we believe, Heather and I, and I hope I can convince you if you don't also, means really tapping into our empathy, our understanding of, and our connection with one another in a way that lets us lead with greater purpose and with greater affinity toward those who are in our work groups, in our classrooms, who are our peers and colleagues.
Yeah, amazing. To that point you just said then, it's, we often hear the conversations, the pandemic changed everything, but what you really talk about is actually what we experienced was an acceleration of things that were already happening. And possibly to that last point, when you talk about the human part, this is a theme that comes up a lot in the book, of that we've shifted into this human value era. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit more with you, Chris. So this idea that we want to be able to create the conditions to thrive, especially in our schools. And we have this whole new measure of success. Could you unpack that a little bit more with our audience this morning?
Wow, that's a big box to unpack. So let's take it a little bit at a time. And I'll say that a lot of my thinking continues to evolve even since we finished this book just a few months ago. When I think about the human value era, when Heather and I started to talk about it and think about what does that really mean, we were thinking about the context of sort of the workplace that talks about people as resources, right? The human resources, there was always a sense of ownership. These are our people, right? This is we're kind of chess pieces to be used. We're line items on an expense line expense line on an audit sheet. And so when you think about people as capital, as a means of production, it's dehumanizing, right? Because I can now replace one cog with another cog, and we see that often in these sort of hiring sprees and then layoff contagions that happen, for example, here in the United States. But I think it's also true, and I'm going to feel like I might be going into some risky spot here, but I think it's also true, at least in the US, in terms of how we educate, right? If you think about our history in the States, I'll speak from this perspective, and I'll look for heads to nod to tell me if I'm either on track or totally off base for your environment. But we went from a time where, a little bit of read and write and arithmetic was good for most kids. But if we were going to move people out of an agricultural, dominantly agricultural economy into an industrial one, and then into a knowledge economy, we had to sort of train, educate in a way that taught children to move toward that workforce, right? And so that's about the discipline of being in a classroom. It's about key curriculum that gave them skills that can be applied in the job. But it was this kind of almost factory, this is, you're going to go through these classes, you're going to learn these things, you're going to sit up straight and pay attention and be respectful to your teachers. And on the other side, you're going to get a job. And that's, you will all now have had your education to train you to be able to be in this job and to be a good cog in that corporate world. And a lot of this is, I'm going to be honest with you all today, I'm sort of going through a lot of my own new thinking about the ways in which we look at the workforce through a very economic lens, right? How much production can I get from these people? How little do I need to pay to get maximum productivity? And that mindset, it completely undermines the humanity of the person who's showing up for work every day, or the child who's in your classroom, or the young adult who is seeking a higher degree. And so I think we're in a coming to this point of reckoning where, when we think about human value era, we're really thinking about what are these human beings that come to work every day, that show up in our classes every day, and how do we help those people tap their intrinsic worth and value in a way that brings kind of collective benefit to society, to our corporations, to our schools. That's just a really different way of thinking about what work means, right? Where work doesn't mean, can I produce enough widgets so that they can be sold at a high enough cost that can maximize profits, but how can I unleash potential to create new things and build new value and generally benefit our economy and our society at large? And I think that shift is we're not there yet. But I think it's on the horizon, and as we can understand it and begin to wrap our heads around what does that mean in terms of how it affects everything from education through our structuring the workforce, we're going to be out ahead of that curve. But I think it's coming, and I think it's going to be a big disruption for those who aren't ready to wrap their heads around that.
Look, fascinating. And I'm listening to what you've just said there. And there's two ways I want to take this conversation, but I'm going to go down this path of a conversation I had yesterday with a leader in a school. And we were talking about the workplace and the people in her workplace, and possibly the different experiences she was having as a leader working with multiple generations in the workplace. And she, in this conversation, talked about a younger generation coming through, this real idea of wanting to have an impact in their work, not only an impact in their own life, but how they can have an impact in the work, and really looking at the structure around their work, not wanting to work 5 days, wanting to have more time and flexibility. And we're unpacking that a little bit more. And I'm just curious to explore with you, Chris, are you seeing this happening in all parts of our workplace, or is this a generational shift we're seeing? What's happening here with this idea of flexibility in our work, wanting to have an impact, shifts around that?
Yeah, well, I think we really see it in Gen Z, right? And let's think about their lives for a minute. And I know many of you are much closer working with that age group, that cohort. But these are people who have basically born into a world in chaos, right? In the US, 9/11, right? And never really seen a peaceful world front since, have been through multiple financial crises, global financial crisis, has seen watched their parents maybe be hired and laid off from work on more than one occasion, just seen a lot of turmoil in their life. And then graduating from high school, entering college under the cloud of COVID, right? So they, you know, the kind of, when we think of as normal things that are these coming of age, have been very different for those folks. In that context, the idea, you know, and I'm just going to lay down my life and go work for the man for 40 years just doesn't feel right, right? It's how can I do something that's going to have impact? Because if it's not going to get any better, it being, you know, global warming and economics and politics and all of these external factors, then what's the point? Well, the point better be that I need to work with some kind of purpose. And so I think that's at play for that generation is in the context of what their life experience has been to date. You know, at the other end of the spectrum, you know, boomers like me are saying, geez, I've worked for 40 years and I don't have a pension. I maybe did or didn't save enough, but I just doesn't feel like I can retire. I'm still very vital. What do I want to do with the next 20, 30 years of my life? Because, you know, statistically speaking, in advances of medicine, I'm 61. I expect that I've got at least another 30 years to go. What do I want to do with that? That's a much more purpose-driven kind of conversation than, gee, the same grind feels really good. I'll go back to the factory tomorrow. And so I think you have, and it's not different for the generations in the middle. We're all kind of looking at, having been through this existential crisis, what am I doing this for? And how do I find an integrated life work balance that allows me to experience the joys of my life and my family and my community, and find joy in my work? And I think that's the question that is happening at every generation. But we kind of miss it. You know, there are enough old farts on my end of the spectrum who are saying, you know, kids today don't want to work. I don't think that's true. I think kids today don't want to work for terrible wages and an awful job with a mean boss. But who does? Right? And so I think this narrative about young people don't want to work or you know, all the permutations of that are more about the work and not about the generation. And I think that's my point here is that work has to change in a way that addresses human ambition, human passion, human purpose, and make it such that a full and whole person can emerge from that work environment, from that academic environment, and not one who feels like they're beaten down, they're working 60 hours a week and they still can't, you know, afford a home or you know, even a night on the town. I think that those dynamics are shifting. There's a lot, maybe I spend too much time in Reddit threads, but I think there's a lot of recognition that work doesn't have to be awful. And when it is awful, I don't have to be there. I am my own person and I can leave. And that's also, I think, driving some of the generational discord that I think we'll find a way to reintegrate. But I've answered about 12 different questions you didn't ask by just rambling there. So I apologize if that's confusing, and you should put me back on track.
Chris, I just love listening to you. And then I remember, oh my gosh, that's right. I've got to be asking questions. I kind of like fall back into this sense of just like having a listen. But yes, no, I love it. But I do want to push you further on that point. We're talking about purpose and talking about impact. And in that book, one of the chapters that really struck me was this concept of purpose and actually looking at purpose from 3 different lenses. Can we just explore that a little bit more of when you're talking about defining purpose and what that means within the workplace and in our own lives?
Yeah, well, I think that I'll start with saying so often, again, in a very much more industrial sense, right? Even maybe in an academic sense, purpose was either a luxury. When I've done my time, when I've put in the work, when I've earned the degree, when I'm ready to retire, then I can do something purposeful. And we have this big P purpose. I'm going to go change the world in some fashion. I don't think all purpose is world peace and ending hunger, right? Purpose is that thing which is an intrinsic motivator. So what is it that when I get up in the morning, I say, this is going to be a happy day because I'm going to get to do this thing, right? And this thing may be, caring for another person. It might be trying to create the molecule that ends bladder cancer. I was talking with somebody about that last night. I mean, amazing stuff's going on, right? And there's, again, big P purpose and little P purpose. When, however, when whatever it is that is your purpose, what it is that motivates you, really drives you, and you can focus your work and your learning on that, then you don't need to have someone behind you pushing you, right? Because you are ready to go do that. You're going to be a proactive learner. You're going to be a proactive worker. You're going to be deeply, deeply engaged. When then you take that purpose and you can align it with place, right? And with in this case, place maybe being a job, an organization, a company. You think, if my purpose and your purpose align, then we are now working together, right? And so the friction goes away, and that drives even more. I like to think of as performance rather than productivity. Productivity tends to be how many widgets did we put out today? Right? How many graduating seniors did we do? How many? We start counting things. I think performance speaks to something deeper, which is, how are we able to create value together? How are we able to grow together and learn together? And when purpose is aligned, mine to yours, ours to an organization, there is so much energy behind that you can't help but to create new value. And I think that's when I think about purpose, and I'm always kind of having that internal conversation with myself. What am I going to do next? What is it that's driving me? And I was, thinking about that just yesterday. I was thinking about, okay, I've got this, the book is out, we've had the launch, I want to start working on this new project. And I just framed it, when am I happiest in my workday? When do I feel smart? When do I feel like I've accomplished something? What am I doing in those moments? Because if I can do more of that, then I can now center my work on that. And the answers there are going to be different for everyone, right? Depending on kind of what it is that is driving you. But for me, it's, I love having conversations like this, talking to people, learning from people, interviewing, being able to, sometimes say, I don't know what I think until I say it out loud. So thank you for recording this, by the way, so I can go back and figure out what it is I think. Those experiences become the intrinsic driver. And then getting up in the morning is, I get to go do this thing, not, oh, I have to do that thing. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of trying to tap purpose, so that you're stoking internal fires, the intrinsic desire to be participating in the economy, in the workplace, in the places of learning in our society overall.
Fascinating, because I wonder if that lends itself to some of the challenges, if you're a leader in a school, of we are leaning into change, and part of that is about building the capacity of people in our organization, in our schools, to be able to tap into their purpose. But possibly, as well as we're experiencing some of this change, people are in a space of not knowing, a little bit of uncertainty, of vulnerability. We're asking them to kind of, I was talking with a school leader yesterday, Chris, and they've introduced a Changemaker curriculum and looking at bringing their staff along that journey of acknowledging that in moving out of maybe traditional ways of teaching, there's a sense of loss around that, of kind of letting go of how we've always done things to embrace something new. And I'm actually going to take a moment. I've got it bookmarked here because I love this chapter in the book. And it starts with, I don't know if you know which one I'm going to read, Chris, but it's 171. And it says, I don't know. That's how the chapter says. Say it again. Get comfortable with those words, because there's so much that you don't know, so much that others don't know. And it's just fine, even if it is uncomfortable. And it was very much the conversation with this leader yesterday of building the capacity of staff, not only to tap into their sense of purpose, but to support them through a change of possibly not knowing, uncertainty and vulnerability. And this requires that empathetic leadership, and as you say in the book, to embrace our superpowers. Tell us more about this.
Well, I would say there is so much power and I think relief in saying, I don't know. Especially when you can say, I don't know, but let's find out together. Let's learn together. Now you've moved from a place of defeat, I don't know, to a place of empowerment. Let's go find out. Let's go learn. And that's exciting, right? To think of every unknown as an adventure. That's a mindset change, right? And you know, I want to be really honest here. Change is hard. You know, change is anxiety producing. If someone came into your classroom and said, you know, all old curriculum is out the window, got to do it differently, I don't think your first reaction is going to be, yay, let's go do that, right? It's like, gee, you know what? You know, and so getting to the place, I think part of part of the change management, I was trying to avoid using those words because it feels very corporate, but it's helping anything. Young kids is really important, right? What happens when things get disrupted? You know, when we're little, we cry, and maybe we throw a temper tantrum, and then maybe we get somehow placated and we move on, right? That's how a lot of kids learn to deal with change. It's like first have a fit. And we take that into our adult lives. And maybe we don't get to throw ourselves on the floor of the grocery store and kick our heels anymore, but we might want to. And it might feel like that's the right thing to do because that's what we have been trained to do, rather than, boy, this is all going to be different. So what's the adventure we're on now? What do we need to know? You mentioned it in your introduction, right? I think we spend a lot of time searching for answers without really searching for questions. So what are the right questions that we should be asking now to help us move to a place of tackling this change, seeing it as opportunity and not as crisis, and being willing to let go? It's very hard to move forward when you're tethered to something behind you. And so those are muscles, those are skills that we need to develop. And when you can develop those skills from a very young age, that sense of learning and adventure versus fear and uncertainty, I think you put people on a much more positive path going forward. And I think that then puts them in a place to have take that mindset into their working careers.
Yeah, it's kind of that idea of, you know, as we build cultures, and we'll have to unpack that as well. But this idea of when we look at opportunities to empower others, we create this ripple effect of change far greater than anything that we could do on our own. And you use that proverb, the African proverb in your book. I'm hoping I get it right. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And we talk about this a lot in schools at the moment, how we build a culture that is collaborative. And possibly I'd like to unpack that a little bit with you though, Chris. We talk about this culture all the time as a word that comes up in our schools, and it's possibly a term that's misused or not fully understood. So let me go out on a limb here and define it today in this conversation as the shared beliefs and the values and the assumptions of a group of people, or the way things work around here. And if you look at it from a lens of empathy and trust, how do we build that culture in our schools? What are some shifts that we need to undertake?
Well, I think I always say this, I spent much of my career working with early stage technology startups, and I loved to just observe them. You know, how is this organization working? How is it growing? How is it managing all the crazy things that happen to a company in its first few years? And my observation from that was that, and I think this is true generally of all companies and probably schools and other environments, everything has a culture, and it's either intentional and explicit and usually productive, or it's accidental, and those tend to be toxic. And part of that is that I think a healthy culture is one where, well, let me just maybe start. In my definition of culture is basically just, it's the operating system, right? It's the rules. It's the shared values and understanding that when we all agree, we can work effectively together. And we can do that. I think it's really the only method from a young organization, for example, to scale, because you get too large to be everybody. You have to go back and say, am I doing the right thing? Am I making the right decision? Is this the right choice? If the culture is known, I now have context to make decisions independently. And I think that's is as true in a classroom environment as it is in a corporate one. But cultures have to be nurtured, right? And so that means both celebrating, making sure we're really explicit about what the culture means, and celebrating places where that's been embraced and where people are making decisions along the operating principles of the organization. It also needs to be sanctioned, which I know sounds like a very hard word, but when someone in the organization acts counter to the culture, whether accidentally or deliberately, you've got to bring them back in line, which sounds a little like herding cats maybe, and I don't mean to be quite so authoritarian, but when people say, well, listen, we all believe that integrity is important, but then one little liar keeps getting away with the lies, what you say to everybody else is, oh, they didn't really mean that, right? I can get away with it too. Or they're not really true to this organization because they're letting this cancer grow. And I'll still keep telling the truth because you said it matters, but clearly this person's getting ahead by cheating, and that's not fair. And you create this cynicism and discord. And so you have to immediately address those folks who are off script, right? To say, this is not how do we work. And in a corporate environment, it's different in a classroom, right? It's hard to expel someone. But in a corporate environment, you have to make the hard decisions to say, listen, the first time you violated our culture, that was my fault as a leader. I wasn't clear to you how important it is that these values are the way in which we operate. The next time there's a violation, it's that I sat down with you, I had that conversation, and clearly you didn't get it. So now this is on you. And this is now the corrective behavior that needs to happen. And then, that then is, again, molding people back into the culture and giving them a choice to participate in the culture as full citizens of the culture versus as these sort of free agents that are disruptive of the culture. And that's, I think, part of a leader's job in any kind of setting is to be ensuring that culture is consistently cared for, consistently curated and nurtured, so that it is clear how one participates and what is acceptable, what's not acceptable as you move forward and you're able to collaborate and work together.
That intentional focus on culture building, and to Peter Drucker's his quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And no matter how detailed and wonderful our plans are and our aspirational vision to achieve that, if we don't work on the human part, that is the people in our organization, and we're not building that culture to achieve that aspirational vision, it doesn't matter how wonderful your strategy is, it'll be very, very difficult to bring that to life.
That's right.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the last 10 minutes. I don't know where the time has gone. It's just, and I do invite, if anyone's sitting there in the audience and has got a burning question they'd love to ask Chris, now's your time to throw it into the chat so I can bring that into the conversation. But I'd love to just get a couple of little practical strategies here as we wind up in this last 10 minutes. So we've got people sitting on the call today, possibly leaders in school, Chris, or potentially wanting to move into leadership, and possibly sitting there and struggling with all the change that they're sensing around what's happening. What are some ideas, if I was a person sitting in that position, I'm sensing all this change, I want to move my career, not quite sure where it's all going, what are some tips or some ideas that I could implement tomorrow that make me a little bit more comfortable in the work that I'm doing? Big question for the last 10 minutes.
There's a lot there, and I'll see what I think that I would start with, again, in sort of the spirit of the empathy advantage. Really, first, I think self-empathy is really important. Like what's going on in your heart and mind that is, and how can you care for yourself? I mean, is it sort of the put your own mask on before helping others? But I think that sometimes we feel as leaders, whether it's in front of a class or in front of a corporation, that we have to have all the answers, that we have to have our act together and really know how it should all work, and kind of put our own needs somewhere on the back burner as we try to think through these issues. Recognize that you're experiencing change too. You're experiencing this rapid disruption and reformation of what education and a classroom and a later career, what your own career, what those things might look like. And I think by that starting point, then, caring for yourself, it gives you the opportunity to begin to think about how you then can relate more deeply, more empathically to others and care for them. So it sounds kind of selfish maybe, and I don't mean it that way, but start with who you are, because if you're good and you're aligned in your purpose, you're going to be able to find where you fit. And when you fit someplace and you feel that fit, you're going to be far more empathetic, passionate leader, passionate educator, because you know that that's where you belong.
Almost to that point, I know it comes up in the first book, but even unpacking or understanding what our role is, and that may have shifted. And you've talked about this before, of letting go of workplace identity, creating that space to understand what is changing, what are the emerging trends that are kind of shifting the way you work or how you approach your leadership. That one I found was a really key point in the adaptation advantage of just how we redefine our roles, and what sits under there.
Yeah, well, I'll use an example from that book, and I kind of shrouded it. But my youngest brother is a high school or a school district superintendent in the United States, in Western Pennsylvania, and he's coming to the end of his career. And he said, "I don't know what I'm going to do if I'm not an educator. That's what I have done my entire life, and I don't have any other skills." You're kidding me, right? No, he said, "I'm an educator." I said, "So when your teachers walked out on strike and you had to negotiate that to a successful and rapid conclusion, you were a negotiator." "Well, yeah." "And when the elementary school had a catastrophic fire over a holiday weekend and you had to, in the course of a couple of days, reassign 150 kids to different classrooms in different school buildings and change bus schedules and teaching schedules and notify parents. I mean, you're kind of a crisis manager, right? Weren't you?" "Well, yeah." None of those things are necessarily, it was in your curriculum as an educator, but in fact, they're very fundamental to what you do. And I think we get ourselves in this wrapped around the axle of the thing we are. I am a teacher or a doctor or an accountant or a writer or a whatever, that it's really hard to think about what our life is when we're not that, because we haven't really thought about all the things that make us, or that we do, and that make us really good at being that label that we put on ourselves.
100%. It kind of, I can't help but mention at this point, with the work we do at Future Anything, I'm working with young people to really surface what are the skills that sit underneath, the enterprise skills, how they work together well in teams, how we tap into their curiosity, their innovation, how we really nurture that creativity and get them to unleash their passions and their ideas, and look at areas of growth in becoming enterprising thinkers, as opposed to just the knowledge acquisition they may have had in traditional classrooms. Possibly a stretch on that for our educators, of recognizing all the complexities of what the role is as an educator these days, and as it starts to shift and evolve, responding to some of these emerging trends, as you've talked to today, Chris.
Yeah, well, I just need to say, God bless you all for the work you do. I know that it is hard, and you are teachers and civil servants and sometimes absentee parents and counselors and doctors and nurses and all sorts of things that go into what it means to show up in a classroom every day. And I admire all of you and the work that you do.
Here, totally agree with you. I have this very privileged position here at Future Anything and get to travel to places across Australia and work with school leaders and school educators in a variety of schools. And again, every single time walk out of there of just this sense of like just being so inspired when we see the work on the ground and the impact our educators are making with our young people. Truly, truly inspiring. All right, let's wind it up with a last question. I don't know how big this question is. I will try and, but it's been sitting there in the back of my mind of just, you know, we talk about preparing our young people for, I don't want to say the future workplace, because it really is the workplace. It's no longer the future. We're already there. What are some trends? What is it that we could be doing? What are some shifts that we could be doing in our classrooms to really nurture this in our young people to be far more empowered in the work that they're doing or the pathways they're exploring?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one that's easy for me to say because I'm not in your shoes. So I say that up front. And I would say, especially now in the age of these emerging generative AIs, I know there's lots of concern about, why do I have to learn this if I can Google it? And now if I can just ask ChatGPT to write my essay, why do I need to learn to string words together? I think that in that context, in this context of such rapidly shifting culture and society and technology, if you can teach anything, teach curiosity, because that's, curiosity and critical thinking. If we can stay curious and think about things with from a multidimensional way, if we can be empathetic to understand how my thinking and my decisions might affect others or how others might influence my decisions, I think if we can bring those things together, I'd be happy for the rest of my life if kids had to Google the right answer to every history problem, if they could actually stand back and say, I'm just really curious about this, and I want to think hard about it with my friends, and we're going to find people who think differently from us and listen to them and get their perspective before we come to our own conclusions. If that's what somebody graduated from their elementary, secondary education with that mindset, you would have done the most amazing job, and I would be forever grateful.
Yeah, celebrate that. Absolutely, Chris. It has been an absolute pleasure talking with you this morning. To everyone that has joined us this morning, wherever you are across Australia, I know that you've got full days of teaching and school ahead of you. Thank you so much for making the time to join us here at Future Anything. And Chris, we couldn't be more appreciative of your time this morning. You've just popped your email there, and
yeah, please, if you have a question, follow up, I'm happy to try to give it my best shot, but I really appreciate the chance to talk with you today. And I appreciate the smiling early morning faces who made me feel like I was saying something that might be a little bit useful.
Thank you. I'm sure we've got many on the call now, just kind of doing a little fist pump to the air, feeling inspired, ready to start the day. It has been a wonderful conversation, and truly, truly wish you all a wonderful Thursday. Chris, thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.